UCB Life Issues with Paul Hammond.
And as always, a very warm welcome to this week's Life Issues. Now, Patrick Regan, OBE, to give him his proper title, is an activist whose passion is speaking about resilience, courage and well-being. He's founded two award-winning charities, XLP and most recently Kintsugi Hope, in partnership with his wife Diane. And they use in Kintsugi the image of Japanese pottery that has been broken but repaired using golden glue so that the scars become mark of beauty in the hands of a master craftsman. They use that to show how God can work in our lives. Over the years, he's joined me for a couple of Life Issues podcasts, and his passion is that we will be honest as individuals, society, and as a church about our struggles with our mental health. And not just in terms of talking about it either. What he really wants is that we will do something about it, that we will cooperate with God's work of Kintsugi in our lives and the lives of those around us, and put in place frameworks that mean individuals don't have to suffer alone, but can find a meaningful pathway to brighter days, which just so happens to be the title of his latest book and project, brighterdays.life. Once again, working with his regular writing partner, Lisa Hoeksma, Brighter Days is 12 steps to strengthening your well-being. Well, Patrick is with me, and while we're not going to go through all 12, we thought we'd give you a flavour of this new project by picking out 4. So, welcome again. 12 steps, that sounds a bit familiar. Where did the idea come from?
Well, the Kintsugi Hope Wellbeing groups are based on 12 steps to well-being, and that's loosely based on Alcoholics Anonymous, which again is 12 steps. So yeah, we thought, stick with what works. Works for many, many thousands of people around the world. Let's keep with that.
And it is, the idea of it is to create, as you did with Kintsugi, I suppose, create a sense of a developing journey. So are these 12 steps also consecutive? Do you have to work your way through them? Or are they more of here's a thought for this situation, here's a thought for that situation?
Yeah, probably a bit of the second bit, actually. I always think the way Kintsugi works is more like a buffet rather than a set menu. So what it is there's just loads of content. And particularly with this book, I really wanted to write a book when I was struggling with my mental health. People kept recommending books to me, and normally they were very thick and very dense and full of medical language that I didn't really understand. And my head was all over the place. I couldn't read a chapter coherently, And so when I wrote this book, I wanted to write it for someone who's really struggling. And so I wrote it with that in mind. So short stories, poems, illustrations, things that could really help if you could get hold of it, little tools that we can use for our well-being. Paul, I live in Chelmsford in Essex, which is really flat. And I have a dog called Hope, which I know is a really stupid name for a dog. You imagine my poor neighbours. They heard me basically for 6 months shouting out at the top of my voice every morning, "No Hope!" They thought me and my wife were going to get divorced. In fact, they actually heard me shout out, "Diane, I've lost Hope." She's jumped over the fence. But I live in Essex. It's really flat. But wherever I take Hope for a walk, I try and find a little incline. And just to get a little bit higher, just to get a different perspective. And I guess with Brighter Days, that's what I was hoping for, that maybe it would just give people a tool, a little bit of hope, a little spark, which actually helps them look at their lives, their mental health, their well-being, their emotional health, just a little bit differently. Because small changes can make a dramatic difference. And that was my prayer for this book.
And as you say, it is very much written in bite-sized chunks. It has, even within the chapters, and the chapters are not onerous to read, but even within the chapters, there are obvious cut-off points where people can take a pause, can take time to reflect, or just put it down and come back the next day and pick it up again. So it is very accessible. From your point of view, if it's going to work, you lay it out pretty clearly, Brighter Days, 12 steps to strengthening your well-being. You're not kind of being vague about what you hope it's going to do. If it's going to work for me, what do I need to do to really engage with this?
I mean, I think it's like anything. You know, you need to sort of throw yourself into it, really. And I think the key about this book is it's practical. That's what I love. All the endorsements. You know, when you get you send your book off, and you wait for the endorsements to come back, and that's sort of like a terrifying wait. You know, and what are they going to say? And what I loved about what people said was, oh man, it was so practical, which means that hopefully if you apply this particular wellbeing tool to your life, it's going to make a difference. And I think that's what I really wanted to do. Paul, whenever I write a book, at the end of it, I always go, I'm never writing another book ever again. And my wife sort of rolls her eyes at me and says, yeah. 6 months. And but with this one, the reason I did it was over 6 months, probably 6 or 8 months period, I had 3 people come up to me and basically said, hand on heart, I'm not sure I'd be alive today if it wasn't for one of your books. It met me in a really, really dark place. And I was like, you know, over the last 30 years of doing this type of work, I've learned stuff that works. And I thought, let me pour all of that into this book. I wrote it for a general market audience really intentionally because I wanted to take the content into businesses. Last night I was speaking at an awards evening in a school, 400 people were there. The previous week I was speaking at a local council event, and I just think everyone needs to invest in their well-being, and if we put our well-being first, we'd be a totally different society.
And the truth is, the imagery of it and the imagery of the title, and I suppose the chapter titles for anybody that has looked at this sphere, I mean, they're pretty familiar. So you've got a chapter on honesty and anxiety and depression and shame and anger, grief and loss, perfectionism, forgiveness, and so on. It goes through. So I mean, it's familiar fare in some ways, but it does seem to me that you have tapped a nerve with the image of it, because so many people feel as though they are living under a dark cloud and just longing for the sky to clear and to see a shaft of sunlight break through.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I say in the book that to say there's going to be a brighter day, you have to admit there's been dark days. And I think the book's very real and honest about that. There's a story in the book where my wife, who became my carer for a while when I was going through major limb reconstruction surgery, and during that period of my time, my mental health was spiraling out of control. I just felt like I was falling and I couldn't stop myself. And, you know, some people are like, well, just pray your way out of it and do this and do that. I just felt like nothing was working for me. And of course, because I had a very visible injury, people gave me a lot of attention, but my wife was really struggling. And she said that one day she just had enough. You know, she went into her bedroom. It's my bedroom as well, I'm glad to say. And she basically went, I just can't do this anymore. And you know that saying, there's always light at the end of the tunnel? It was almost like the tunnel's too long. I can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. It just feels too dark. And she just felt this sense inside of her saying, stop looking for light at the end of the tunnel. And she was like, well, that's not very encouraging. And it was like, look up, see the pinpricks of light in the love of your community and your friends. And you know what? Just take a day at a time. And if you have to, just take an hour at a time and get through. And I think that sometimes that's what we can help people do, you know. There's a Chinese proverb in the book, which I absolutely love, that says, it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness.
Yes.
And when I think of society, when I think about what's going on in Gaza or Ukraine, or even the mental health crisis here in the UK, I'm thinking I'd rather light a candle than curse the darkness. I'd rather be that person who goes, you know what? It's not all despair. There is hope. And if there's a flicker of light, then let's go for that and fan that into flame.
You're listening to UCB Life Issues. I'm Paul Hammond. My guest this week is Patrick Regan. We're talking about his latest book and initiative. It's called Brighter Days, 12 Steps to Strengthening Your Wellbeing. Who's it published by, Patrick?
SPCK.
And so you can find it online, and there's also an audiobook version of it.
Yeah, which I have to say, Paul, a lot of respect for you guys, you know. That was a challenge and a half.
Yeah, people think it's easy. You just switch the microphone on and speak, but it takes a bit of practice. It really does. It is a great book, as we mentioned already, very accessible, especially if you are struggling with your mental health. Very clearly written to enable you to have those bite-sized chunks that you might need. And although we can't, and we wouldn't go through all 12 chapters of it, all 12 steps of it, we did think, as I said earlier, we'd give you a flavour by picking out 4. So I wonder if we can start with the ideas and the concepts in the chapter around shame, because each chapter starts with a little phrase, and in shame it says this: never allow your shame to tell you that you are not worthy of connection, belonging and love. Unpack these thoughts for us a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think shame is one of the key issues to look at when you look at your mental health. And, Brené Brown's done a lot of amazing work on this. And I think there's the first thing to say, there's a massive difference between guilt and shame.
Yeah.
Guilt is, I've done something wrong. If some of my workforce, some of my colleagues here are late every day for work, I want them to feel guilty because then the next day they may be on time. So true guilt can push us to be better maybe, but shame isn't saying I've done something wrong. Shame is believing that I am wrong and I'm not worthy of love. I'm not, it's that sense of feeling completely worthless. And Brené Brown rightly says that shame loves silence, secrecy and judgment, and that it has 2 gremlins. Shame says to you, who do you think you are? And you're not enough. And then I think what happens is shame drives different behaviors like perfectionism, which we talk about in the book, which then drives anxiety. And so shame often is that key point which we need to deal with. And that's why I think it's a really important chapter to talk about.
What does it, I mean, you've touched on it there, but can we just unpack a little bit more what it does to me? When shame takes hold of my thought patterns and takes hold of my well-being, what does it create in my perspective?
Yeah, I think the messages that shame creates is that sense of good. If you try something new, you shouldn't have tried that. You knew you're going to fail. You should have known better, and constantly telling you that you're a failure, that you're not worth anything. And so that feeling worthless. So then if you don't value yourself, then you don't treat yourself very well, do you? And sometimes, I've seen it with other people as well. If you don't value yourself, then why should you value others? And so it really just comes down to that key. There's an illustration in the book I found really helpful. And I don't know, when you as a kid you used to go to the pier, there's a machine there called whack-a-mole. Or whack-a-croc, but whack-a-mole, where these moles appear, and then you've got a hammer and you whack them, and obviously they then disappear, and then they just come quicker and quicker and quicker until you're frantically trying to whack these moles as fast as you can, and of course it's never possible. And my friend, a really good friend, Will Vanderhart, who's done a lot of writing on shame, he says, it's a little bit like perfectionism pops up in our life and we try and whack it, or anxiety pops up and we try and whack it. But actually, we've got to ask ourselves is what's driving the perfectionism? What's driving the anxiety? And the answer is normally shame. And of course, in order for the moles to stop popping up, you need to turn the machine off. You need to do something radical to have a radical reset. And I think that's the antidote to shame. Is always going to be empathy, it's always going to be understanding, and it's always going to be compassion, and getting our head around that.
But the problem is, for many people, I suppose, that shame starts, and I get your point that shame can become an all-consuming mindset, but it does often start because we do something, because we let somebody down, because we fail somewhere, because we do things that cause pain and hurt to others, and then confronted by that, we are ashamed of it, and then we transfer that shame to ourselves. So how do we break that pattern? How do we break that hold?
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that shame can start from many different factors as well. Trauma is a huge driver to shame, and sometimes religious beliefs as well. I've known a lot of people that have been within the church community who've been almost shamed into certain types of behavior, almost like told you're so worthless that you can't do anything, then actually results in, and I never think that shame's a great motivating tool. I think it's very, very deadly, very dangerous. And I think the first thing that to say is the key to actually dealing with anything is that awareness, isn't it? Is that self-awareness. Stephen Convoy, who wrote that book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, sold 40 million copies. And basically, if you could distill it into one thing, the most effective people who deal with stuff are those that are self-aware. Those that go, actually, I recognize that behavior in myself. And I think that the antidote to shame is actually trying to, so instead of treating yourself with harsh words, is learning to actually treat yourself with compassion and self-compassion. And that's something, again, that we unpack further in the book, because a lot of these themes intertwine, don't they?
Yeah.
And interweave. And actually, instead of actually, and it's a habit that needs to be cultivated. That's the thing, because it doesn't always come naturally. And then, of course, as Christians, we believe, that that God's love is something that is the antidote to shame as well. I love the bit in the book where it talks about what would God's first words be to you, and so often I think that we think, well, maybe it'll be, welcome, but you could have done that a bit better. And, yes. Just about scraped in.
Yeah.
But wouldn't it be amazing if, God's first words, Brennan Manning says this, is, did you believe how much I love you? Did you get it? Did you believe how much I love you? And I think that is almost letting that sink in is one of the best antidotes to shame.
Yeah. Let's take a look at some of the moles then, if we're playing whack-a-mole, and if shame is the machine. Some of those things that do pop up and blight our lives. One of the ones that you pick out in the book is the idea of perfectionism. And you say this: perfectionism is a moving target we will never hit. But isn't it actually good to aim to be the very best we can? Or is that maybe something different to perfectionism?
No, I think there's a massive difference between perfectionism and trying your best. I think perfectionism is about that unrelenting standards that we put ourselves under, that we get all our identity through achieving the whole time. Perfectionism causes depression, it can cause anxiety, it can cause a whole host of very serious mental health disorders, actually. And it's a moving target you never hit. Going back to my dog Hope, when I take her for a walk, I take her to the fields. She has got one thing on her mind. And the one thing she has on her mind, and she's had on her mind every day for the last 5 years, is as soon as I let her off the lead, is I'm going to catch a rabbit. And she races off into the distance. And then within 2 minutes, she comes back absolutely exhausted. And in 5 years, she's never caught a rabbit. And I think perfectionism's a bit like that. It's like we waste so much time trying to hit this target that we're never going to hit. And I was speaking at this awards evening in a school yesterday, and I was saying to the kids, trying your best is a fantastic thing. But you've got to realize that life isn't going to be perfect. Mm-hmm. We want the perfect relationship, the perfect marriage, the perfect career. Life hits you hard at times. And if you're trying to hit that perfectionism target, you're always going to feel disappointed and unworthy and feeling like you're a failure. So, yeah, it's a really important topic.
Well, I took a look at the chapter on it, and you've got an interesting, what I think is an interesting definition of perfectionism, and I suspect it would be very different to most people's sort of instinctive idea as to what perfectionism is, because you say the perfectionism, the thing about it is that you're continually asking yourself, am I good enough? Is there something wrong with me? How can I earn people's approval so they will accept me? How can I push myself harder? How can I do better? How can I be better? And the moment I read it, I thought, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's what perfectionism is. It is that continual craving that we will be approved of by dotting every I and crossing every T and by controlling every element. The thing is, it is something that society seems to aspire to. And you know, you look at it there's an awful lot of workplaces where that's what's expected of people, let alone what we drive ourselves to.
I 100% agree with you, and I think we live in a very perfectionist society. I think our education system, for instance, you know, there's a part in I think it's in the perfectionist chapter where I talk about my daughter Abigail, who has some additional needs. And I remember sitting down with her ahead of year, and we were talking to the fact that due to Abigail's additional needs, it's unlikely that she'll get GCSEs. She has a sight condition called stigmas. She has other additional needs, ADHD, autism, all sorts of things. And the teacher was saying, I don't think she'll get a GCSE. And I said, can I ask you a question? If there's a GCSE in integrity or kindness or teamwork, how do you think she'd get on? Yeah. And she'd get A star. And I went, that's good enough for me, you know? And she said, this is what she's saying, so often as teachers, we feel like we're dancing to a tune we don't believe in. And because the whole culture is achieve this, and that, you know, you will be able to get that. And it's all about, and actually we're not looking at education in the round, you know, educating someone for life, those life skills. As an employer, I know that actually what I'm looking for in people is that sense of teamwork, is that sense of living to their values. And so we live in a very perfectionist society. I think there's a underlying in that to be successful, you need to be wealthy. And then you look at all the people that are super famous and super wealthy, and they all seem quite miserable. And so it is this illusion that we're never going to hear. And our society, actually, we need to have a good look at what we do, the values we promote and how we promote them, and ask ourselves, given the mental health of our young people, and generally it's not working.
And given that perfectionism, and again, this is in the chapter in the book, but given that perfectionism does drive us in that way, does mean that we live a life where we are always worried about what others think of us, or whether we are matching up to others' expectations of us, and all that sort of thing. And granted of how that empowers shame and its control on us, one of the things that you suggest is that it is time for us, and it is a very biblical idea, this is a very Christian idea, it is time for us to embrace brokenness, not to accept substandard integrity and so on, but to embrace the fact that we are not perfect and we will not be perfect. When we get that message, when we take hold of that, what sense of liberty and freedom does that bring?
Huge. It's huge sense of liberty and freedom, you know, just to know that you're being accepted for who you are, flaws and all. And because then you can be truly known, because then you can actually show up as your true self. Because otherwise, you know, so often what we do is we don't show up our true selves. We try and portray this almost like I've got it all sorted type of self. And that isn't true. So we can't be truly known because that isn't really us. And again, in the book, one of my favorite quotes actually in the book is from Brian Stevenson. Brian Stevenson worked with people on death row, you know, and this guy has achieved everything. I mean, he's won every award that you can. He's been recognized as one of the best speakers in the world. And he talks about embracing our brokenness creates a need and desire for mercy, and perhaps a corresponding need to show mercy. Yeah. So when you experience mercy, you learn things that are hard to learn otherwise. You see things you can't otherwise see, and you hear things that you can't otherwise hear. You begin to recognize that humanity lies in every single one of us. And then you start to build really meaningful, deep relationships.
You're listening to UCB Life Issues. I'm Paul Hammond, talking this week to Patrick Regan. He is the author of, amongst many other books, he is the author of Brighter Days, published by SPCK. Brighter Days, 12 Steps to Strengthening Your Wellbeing. And recognizing that we all could do with strengthening our well-being, we're not going through all 12, but we are giving you a flavour of what he is suggesting. And perhaps the suggestion that we need to look beyond the traditional understanding of some of these issues to see a simpler way to actually mend the pottery. Yes, we're back to a Kintsugi reference there again. Can we talk about anxiety for a minute. And one of my personal bugbears and something which kind of dogged my steps for a long time and every so often rears its head again to go, hello, I'm still here if you'd like to take note of me. The little phrase at the beginning of the chapter says, if you struggle with anxiety, I want you to know that you are loved, you are valued, and you have a massive contribution to make to this world. I found that very encouraging. But what on earth has Tetris got to do with it?
So, I don't know, if you're of a certain age, you'll remember the computer game called Tetris.
That is the thing of my nightmares, that tune.
And I'm sure many of your listeners will know what it is, but Tetris was a computer game where basically all these blocks, they fell out of the sky and you have to rotate them because all different sizes and get them in a straight line. Once you get in a straight line, the line disappears. But the problem is they just keep coming and they get quicker and quicker and quicker. So you're frantically hitting your keyboard to try and keep going. And eventually it's just game over. And I think the challenge is, Paul, is that things do tend to go wrong at once, don't they? Life is never straightforward. And I think someone said to me the other day, actually, if you look at a map, if you look at New York and London, it looks like a straight line. But actually, a pilot will never go in a straight line because the weather conditions are different every single day. Yeah. They're probably going to go up, they're probably going to go down. Sometimes it's going to be quicker, sometimes it's going to be slower. And that is life. It is. It happens. But I think the thing about, for me, with anxiety, what was a real game changer for me, actually, was realizing that anxiety isn't weakness, that anxiety often means that you're caring too much. There is an incredible quote in the book from a lady called Kirsty Corlin who says that anxiety is often the most caring person in the room.
Yeah.
And that made me think about anxiety totally differently because, I had it drummed into me, those verses from Philippians, do not be anxious about anything. And then I just felt like rubbish because I felt like I'm anxious about everything, not about anything. I'm anxious about everything. And how can anxiety be the most caring person in the room? And I realized as I started to think about people that I know that struggle with anxiety, is that people that struggle with anxiety are often kind, sensitive, have incredible empathy. But there's a bit of like a car alarm. Car alarm's useful. It has a purpose. If it's going off all the time, it's a bit annoying for you and for everyone else. But it has a function. And so sometimes I think it's about managing our anxiety.
Yes.
And using it for good and not for something that's going to cause us pain.
And put it in the right framework. But of course, for many people, especially it seems in this modern age, at least in the part of the world where we live, anxiety does seem to be such a powerful driver. And again, it comes back to those images of shame. And am I good enough? Am I going to be accepted? What if I get it wrong? What if I can't deal with this? Control, and that all mixes into it as well. And you go through a list of things that you say are unhelpful things to say to someone who struggles with anxiety. Things like, you'll be fine, or cheer up, things could be worse. Usually at that point, the person with anxiety wants to punch you on the nose. Or how about, here's a colouring book? The thing is, when you take it out of context, then you sort of make it stand alone like that. It seems ridiculous, doesn't it? But I wondered if we could just focus in for a moment on some of the things you say are good things to say. Things like, I'm here anytime you need me. Your feelings are valid. Take one step at a time. Don't belittle yourself. What you're facing sounds hard. I'll stay with you. There's for me, it is very redolent of the messaging we get of how Jesus walked with his disciples and says, through the Holy Spirit, he walks with us.
Yeah, 100%. And the fascinating thing about this chapter actually is, because normally when I write books, I do so much research because my perfectionism takes hold and think like, I've got to read every single book on this topic. And so I literally read this ridiculous amount of books, psychology books and theology books and books by activists. And I did all that for this book. But also what I did for every chapter, I did something on social media and I said, what does anxiety feel like to you?
Yeah.
And within literally a couple of hours, I'd have 100 different answers.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating what people are writing, and these bits that you just mentioned came out of that conversation I was having on social media. You know, what's the helpful things, what's the unhelpful things, and I think when it comes to the helpful things is this sense of being alongside and not being the rescuer, which is sometimes hard because, you know, I feel like as a parent and as a friend, I want to rescue. I want to, like, you know, but actually coming alongside is what people really want. They want you. And I often think about Jesus on the road to Emmaus. You know, it's the day after the resurrection. And if a marketing person had come up to Jesus at that point, I think he would have gone, you know what, Jesus, could we do one of those sort of feeding of the 5,000 gigs? Could we get the message out that you're alive? Or Sermon on the Mount Part 2 would be amazing at this point. And it's almost like the day after Jesus' resurrection, he decides that he's going to spend the whole morning walking alongside two people that no one's ever heard of.
Yeah.
And who are heartbroken, who are struggling with anxiety, disappointment, grief, confusion. And the thing I love about this story is as he's walking alongside, he doesn't say, you know, they start saying, have you not heard, you know, Jesus has died. And he, at no point does he go, guys, stop. I'm Jesus. Da-da. We don't need to have this conversation anymore. It's all good. You know, he lets them share their pain and their heartache. And then they get to Emmaus. And even when they get to Emmaus, you know, they persuade him to have dinner with them. He still hasn't done the big reveal. And then I think it's fascinating that as he breaks the bread, they work out who he is. Brokenness reveals who Jesus is every single time. And I've just learned a lot from that. You know, I need to learn to shut up and listen and come alongside and to be gentle, you know, and that's another thing I look at in the book, that gentleness is actually strength. It's not weakness. To be gentle in a world that's just telling you to speed up and hurry up and be strong, to be gentle actually is what people are looking for.
Thing is, one of the things that you suggest we need to do in order to address our anxiety is to see reality. But and many, I mean, we've done many programs over the years where therapists and so on will talk about, you know, seeing the reality as a way to cognitively combat your anxiety and so on and so forth. The trouble is, when you are consumed by anxiety, it's hard to accept the reality that isn't shaped by your vision of anxiety. And you suggest this idea of taking our thoughts to court, which I thought was brilliant. It's so simple when you stop and think about it. Just quickly unpack that one for us. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, again, I was just trying to think of tools that you can use during the day, you know, and because we all know that we're not going to stop negative thoughts. You know, they're just going to come in like trains come into a train station, and that is the reality. But take the thought to court is actually going, you know, if you put that thought in the dock, is there enough evidence to suggest that thought is true? You know, question it. Is that what my friends would say? Is that what a judge would say? What you know, is there, you know, what's the closing statement? And the reality is, most of the time, is that it's not true, or there's an element of truth in it, and it doesn't have the same power when you start to put it into that sort of framework. And so that's for me as a little practical tip, that as I go through my day and bang, there goes another negative thought, I think, all right, I'm going to take this one to court and see see how I get on. Because
it is almost like shining a light on it and actually saying how because so often the thought comes and we go, oh, that's true, and we run away and hide in the darkness. But actually to bring it out into the brighter day, see what I did there? Yeah. That it does make a difference.
100%, you know, and then you get that sense of freedom and liberty, because you realize that actually, you know, we all use absolute statements a lot of the time. You know, I'll always be like this, I'll never be able to get free, or I'm completely useless. And actually, you know what, you may have failed at that particular aspect of your job, or something may have happened, but the reality is that's not your identity, that's not who you are. And I think that's really important to recognise.
You're listening to UCB Life Issues. I'm Paul Hammond, speaking to Patrick Regan. We're talking about, as I've said many times already, we're talking about this incredibly accessible book that he's written that just brings a very sort of everyday reality onto the subject of coping with our well-being. It's called Brighter Days, published by SPCK. 12 Steps to Strengthening Your Well-Being. There is a website that goes with it. Have a look at that for yourself as well. Brighterdays.life. Brighterdays.life. As I say, the 12 steps, we haven't got time to talk about all 12, so we picked out 4. One of the ones I was very keen for us to take a look at is the chapter that you do on the subject of resilience. I wonder if you could first tell us what resilience is and what it isn't, because that's where the little phrase at the beginning of the chapter starts, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I always think of resilience as the ability to bounce forwards, and that was the title of my previous book. And I think a lot of people think resilience is the ability to bounce back. And when I did my research, I had a real issue with that because, you know, people talking about an elastic band and, you know, a ball that bounces back, and that's resilience. And I was like, you know, I feel like life does change us, you know. And I wrote Bouncing Forwards when the pandemic was coming on. And I was like, you know, the pandemic's changed. It's changed me. It's changed my values. It's changed the way I think about the world. And why would I want to go back to my pre-trauma self and learn all those lessons again? And so we started to look at what does it mean to bounce forwards, and what does it mean to take the challenges, you know, whether that's the pain that we've been through and the good stuff, the bad stuff. And then I start to think about resilience as not that adversity won't ever be there, but how do you thrive in the midst of adversity? How do you build that sense of resilience? And I think it was interesting, as soon as you say the word resilience to people, some people react, because I feel like what's happened is we've misunderstood it. We've said, you know, it's just about battling on. It's just about pushing through. It's, you know, there are no limits. And that's again, a very cultural message we have. You know, we will celebrate that sort of 1 out of 100 person that does something incredible against all odds, and we'll say that's resilience, where actually I think there's a maturity in accepting that we are limited. You know, there are only 24 hours in a day. You know, I have a knee condition that means I can't run, I can't do the stuff. And actually accepting that's okay. And I think part of resilience is not repressing our emotions and just putting on a mask and keep going with toxic positivity, but is accepting where we're at and learning that we can thrive in the midst of adversity.
Yeah, and I get that, and I understand that, and I immediately, instinctively agree with you that there's sort of the almost macho drive through, just keep going no matter what, keep running up that hill sort of mentality. No matter how great the storm is, we will not flag. The truth is, sometimes we flag, and sometimes we have limits, and sometimes we can't go any further. It's obvious. So what then is resilience? How do we define resilience in our everyday experience and in the things that we are facing every day? What is it? If it's not just pushing through, what is it?
Yeah, I mean, there was an interesting lady called Libby Webb, and she talks about resilience as putting on a sunscreen. And I was like, what does that mean? And she's going, it's not shielding yourself away from the sun, but it's actually putting on a protective layer, which means that it will actually help you to be able to keep doing the stuff that you need to do, even when the sun's out. And I think that's quite a helpful analogy to think about resilience. And another really helpful analogy, which has helped me no end, and I've heard so many stories, and we use it in the book, is what's called the Resilience River.
Yeah.
And it's from a guy called Professor Patrick Bertoni, who says, like, every river virtually has rocks at the bottom. And and those rocks represents tough stuff that we go through in our lives. And many books describe how you get those rocks out of your river. You know, so a rock for me is anxiety. I struggle with anxiety. It doesn't control me the way it used to, but it's still there. You know, perfectionism, I know that I'm prone to it. Loss, my uncle died a year ago and he's not coming back and I miss him. But I know if my resilience river is low and I'm rowing my boat on it, I'm going to crash into those rocks.
Yes.
So we're looking at how do we keep our resilience river high, which means the rocks don't disappear, they're still there, but actually we can float across them. And I think the really interesting thing about that is one size never fits all. So the things that drain your river and the things that drain my river may be very different. And the things that raise us up and actually keep us at a level keel may be different as well. And so I've been going into businesses, I've been going into universities, and we've been doing this exercise with all different types of people from different types of society. And I love it because everyone's different.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to reflect on what actually keeps you resilient at those difficult times.
And recognizing what drains your river and what keeps it full is important. Recognizing the reality of the presence of the rocks is important as well. In fact, you actually, in the chapter, you talk about how acceptance of the realities of our weaknesses, our failings, the things that impact us, the things that triggers us, accepting that is the key.
So for me, acceptance is absolutely key. And this was the bit, Paul, I really struggled with as a Christian, because I had so many people that used to say to me, Patrick, you can't accept that negative thought.
Yeah.
As soon as that negative thought hits your brain, you need to bash it with the word of God, you know. And I just got exhausted. And then I just felt guilty that I was doing a really bad job at it. And actually it was, I got to meet Archbishop Desmond Tutu once and do some stuff with him. I hope you caught that name as it dropped there.
I'll just pick it up for you. Give me a second.
And he said acceptance and resignation are two really different things.
Yes.
And that made me really think that acceptance is always the first path to healing. And then I started to do more research and particularly looked at Holocaust survivors and survivors of POW camps. And the interesting thing about that research was the people that died in those camps and in Auschwitz and places like that were the optimists. The optimists would be like, I'll be out by January, I'll be out by Easter. And of course, you know, Christmas and Easter came and went and they were still there and they died. The people that did the best were those that accepted the situation they were in, adapted to it, and even found some meaning in the pain. And they're the guys. And of course, there's something like Auschwitz, there was a great deal of luck as well. And I think they'd be the first to say that. Yeah. But actually, that is significant. And so I've learned when I thought about resilience, you know, accept the situation you're in, adapt, adjust, and maybe even find some meaning, some purpose in the pain.
But there's a key point there, isn't there? There's a key point in what Archbishop Tutu said to you. There's a difference between resilience and sort of rolling over and playing dead. And it's really important. I mean, you've said it there. It is acceptance and adaptation, not acceptance and just sit back in a corner and let it happen.
Yeah, 100%. 100% is very different to resignation. And resignation is I quit, I've had it, I can't do it anymore. And that's very different. And it's a subtle difference, but it's a really important difference as well. Because like, if we don't come to that place of acceptance, we will just end up exhausted and disillusioned. If we just roll over and die, then obviously, you know, what's the point of that? But if we can accept the situations we're in and adapt to it, and you know, and we do that with our physical health quite a lot. You know, I remember when I went for major limb reconstruction surgery on both my legs, you know, there was no denying I had to go through it and I had to adapt. But when it comes to our mental health, we don't tend to think about it in the same way. And I think it's important that we go through this process. And I don't believe that like everything happens because God causes it, like particularly God causes all the pain and the suffering in my life. But I do believe nothing is wasted. And I do believe in that old little saying, you know, your test become your testimony, and it can help other people, and it makes you hopefully kinder and softer and being able to relate to people in a completely different way. And I know that's been my experience. And so people often say, are you glad you went through all the things that you've been through? And I don't think I've got to that place yet. Maybe I will one day, because it was really hard and really difficult and really dark. But I recognize that actually, like the art of Kintsugi, is that God can make something beautiful out of brokenness. And I've been pretty broken at times.
The book is called Brighter Days, 12 Steps to Strengthen Your Wellbeing. The website is brighterdays.life. And the reality is we live in a world where for so many people, it does feel as though there is a cloud over so much of their lives. Finding a way to let the sun shine through, finding a way to connect with a positive improvement to our well-being, finding a way to address the voice of shame or anxiety or perfectionism, to find the security, the river, if you like, of resilience is absolutely critical for so many who are struggling with just everyday living. The reality with this book, with the truth of faith that lies behind it, is that there is a way to deal with these things honestly, compassionately, with empathy, not with condemnation or blame or unfounded guilt. And in that way, and that core foundation of a relationship with a God who looks at us, sees us as we are, and tells us that we are loved, there is a way to draw back the curtains, open the window, and find a brighter day. brighterdays.life is the website. Brighter Days, 12 Steps to Strengthening Your Wellbeing is the book. Fascinating concepts in it. Patrick, good to speak to you about it today. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you also to Rebecca, my producer for today's programme. I'm Paul Hammond. Why not join me next week for another Life Issues? Ta-da!